The Sleepers, Chapter 34, Parental Visit. Over 6 months had passed since our first date, and somehow we had avoided ever meeting Ray or my family. The playful banter coupled with physical attention fueled our connection, but the wedge of secrets was mounting, and keeping her isolated from the web of my life was exhausting. Despite Jane's insistence, I kept relations distant and unknown. The silence was neither personal nor unilateral. I likewise said nothing to my parents, nor to Ray. To them, I was a quiet hermit, busy in work and sleep, but to Jane, the undivided attention and repeated dinners for two was taxing. I resisted meeting her parents, preferring absolute anonymity, but I finally acquiesced to distract her efforts of personal invasion. Meeting the parents would risk future operations, but I could risk losing Jane entirely without this slight surrender. Like all great shows, dinner with the parents was a test of character appearances. They came off as surprisingly less sleep purists than Jane, meaning Jane's profession had been the real influence she described, or they were good at lying about their MD tendencies. Consequently, her parents were more impressed by my position at Sleep Free and eager to know any gossip about the heir. Mothers tended to love the appeal of wealth until they engaged the empty void behind the owner. I had hoped that meeting Jane's parents would buy me months without further questions, but one issue struck Jane as a conspiracy desperate to be cracked. Carefree dinners only lasted another week after her parents before she asked again. Our nighttime ritual, dinner and couch time, always started late, giving me enough time to finish my first and second job. I learned quickly that seeing Jane before finishing Ray's sleep made for a very rough night, the sacrifice usually paid with my own rest. While I slept for Ray, she'd often go home, shower, change into something she deemed both more appealing and less conformist, even take a nap, and then join me about the time I woke up. But as we'd grown closer, a couple days a week now, she'd come straight over, still in her silly gray scrubs, find a comfy chair in the living room, or go to the deck and just grade papers, as the only sleeper teacher giving homework, or read until I finished my sleep. This was all so different than Samantha. We were a real couple. Minutes before my 7-hour alarm went off, she'd sneak into bed with me so she could pretend she'd been there all along. Jane never cooked us dinner while I slept because I loved cooking. It was a slow tragedy to gobble up our short time together in the kitchen, but I liked the purpose, the method, the opposition to everything Sleep Free stood for in giving us time, and we both really liked what I made. Credit to my mom, for sure. We were back on the red living room couch, cuddled up, having just finished our meal. Jane pointed at the locked door down the hallway and asked with forced casualness,
"So, what goes on in your room back there? You have to tell me. It can't just be storage. You are too clean and minimalistic to have a locked room full of junk."
The more time we spent together, the more my secret bothered her. I had a locked room of which I never mentioned, and I kept her aloof of all my personal connections. We never went anywhere except for each other's homes, spending most time at my house, for which I blamed my sleep position. All playful banter, all casual conversations would bring us back to the room. She was clearly obsessed. "It's just a room," I repeated emphatically, the same way I had every previous time. She pushed again, sensing I must have a limit.
"If it's just a room, then you can just show me and settle this mystery. Couples keep a few secrets, but not secret rooms."
Then teasing me, she added,
"For all I know, it could be a torture chamber for ex-girlfriends."
I had to lie and finish this questioning. I was not ready to reveal everything, but I could resist no more. "Okay, you win. You are a relentless woman. Sorry, I thought I had a few more months before needing the torture room." She laughed in my arms, but looked at my eyes just to be certain of the joke, then thrust her elbow into my side as a playful jab. "Come on, before I change my mind or you beat me up." I pushed her bottom off me, and we walked down the hall. Jane almost skipped. Perhaps it was the right time for an ally, or at least a half-truth, although this could go terribly wrong. I opened the lab with my keys. "Look inside. Here's where I do my best work."
"You're a mad scientist!"
she exclaimed, peeking in her head and cataloging the piles of tubes and chemicals, boilers and computers.
Well, I guess the torture is out.
She started to walk through the lab, casually as if she didn't care, picking up a beaker or running a finger over the clean counters, inspecting my makeshift ventilation lines. She could flirt with her body language, doing anything, and still she'd deny flirting. Maybe, I chuckled. This is my personal laboratory. I keep it secret because I don't need the world knowing what I do. I'm a scientist and love my work. Here's where I come up with some of my best ideas for the company. Work runs too short by the time I add Ray's sleep time. This way I catch up in the odd hours and maintain my competitive advantage, and keep the family safely employed. Compounding my lie, I added, I do my best work away from the busy office. This lab has been worth the investment. Jane slapped my chest and laughed. You are an adorable nerd. But why take so long to tell me, John? You can trust me. This response required no lies. I'm a naturally mistrusting person. You're the only person who knows about this laboratory. Let that signify my trust in you and this relationship. The apparent honesty settled Jane, and she returned to our love affair free of cankerous questions. I had thankfully cleared out the test rats last week, knowing she would ultimately expect a peek behind the curtain as a sign of trust. We closed the door to the lab, having settled the mystery, and retired back to the couch as a knock came on the door. No one ever visited. This was a strange evening. Must be a peddler who broke past security. Just ignore it, I laughed. The knock came again with a muffled voice through the door. John, it's your parents. You home? What were they doing here? This was even more unusual. I couldn't prevent my worlds meeting now. For a quick moment I felt like a guilty teenager caught with his girlfriend in need of a good hiding place. But this was my home, and I was an adult. I didn't need to run to the backyard like I did with Sam. They were the intruders, and I'd have to face this one directly. Jane's eyes widened with excitement, knowing I couldn't escape. She would get her wish, further cracking into my world. I would get my nightmare, having my parents crack into mine. Mom and Dad! What a pleasant surprise, I said while opening the door. Then with over-enunciated staccato, I did not know you were coming. My father, detecting the underlying tone, replied, Sorry to intrude unannounced. We were downtown for an engagement, and thought to come by as we rarely visit your place. We tried calling first, but there was no answer. We had been in the laboratory and missed the ring. Our exchange took place at the entryway, and my parents hadn't yet observed Jane. Despite Jane's aching curiosity, she refrained from dashing to the doorway to introduce herself. But before I could usher my parents away, my mother assumed matriarchal privileges and strolled into my home. She was startled and giddy by the surprise on the couch. Oh, you have company. Sorry, John. We didn't know. Hello, I'm John's mother, Susan, she said, extending her hand. And you are? I'm Jane, your son's girlfriend. Nice to meet you. At this point, many women would rail a man for never having told his parents of one's existence. Many more would glare and abuse you later. Not so with Jane. She was too direct and wonderfully irksome. I'm guessing he's never mentioned me? Asked Jane, almost rhetorically. Then he never tells you anything either. Very private man, your son. It's taken me a long time to crack him, but the yolk is coming. Long time, repeated my mom as she stared back at me. John, how long have you been together? Then adding embarrassment to her glare, I am anxious for grandchildren and need some hope to cling to at my age. There was nothing subtle about my mother's unspoken rebuke. Both women aimed to kill. The jibe about grandchildren was lemon to the wound. Jane answered for me. There's a ways yet before grandchildren, but first let's start this relationship, said Jane as she motioned her fingers between herself and my mother. Then, pulling my mother closer, they settled into the couch. Here sat Europe's conquerors, dividing the subjugated states. If our encounters are going to be this infrequent, we need to exchange as much information as possible tonight. My mother could not have agreed more, and smiled with glee. Controlling Jane was out of the question. John Jr. looked at me and laughed. Well, son, looks like we have some catching up to do as well. Staring back at the women, he added, and plenty of time to do it. Exiting the living room, we went to the porch, closed the sliding doors, and stared at the city alive under the night sky. He proceeded to quiz me about Jane. She looks familiar, John. Where have I seen her? Jane received an award at the gala last year. You were there, I reminded him. Yes, of course, that's it. So is that where you met? I gave my father enough details to satisfy his obligatory questions before we gravitated to our preferred subjects of sleep and research. He respected our awkwardly distant relationship and avoided anything too taboo for us. When we felt the women had exhausted enough gossip time, we returned to the living room. Mother, it's time to go, declared John Jr. But I haven't started with your son yet, protested my mother. Let the lovebirds have their evening, countered John Jr., as he gracefully extracted my mother. It was nice to meet you, Jane. Likewise, repeated Jane courteously. And you too, said Jane, extending her hand to my mother. Susan reciprocated with an ecstatic hug. The potential of grandchildren, even the thought I might be dating, thrilled my mother enough for an impromptu hug. Chapter 35. Lab Rats. It had been a long day of research and bureaucracy, so I canceled my evening with Jane. We were not the type of people to suspect ill fates if we missed a day together. We were passionate realists. I came home to upload Ray's sleep, preferring the solitude of my apartment versus the office sleep station. I needed time to think. I was trialing one of the last concoctions from the nightmare circuit, and had yet to shatter the lucid wall. Jane's companionship was a welcome connection, a bit of humanity that I had forgotten or never known mattered, but her frequent visits and near carte blanche interruptions now in my private laboratory restricted true research. I prioritized the goal over the girl when I was very young. I needed the solution or she had to go. It was too difficult to have it both ways, and I would soon need another batch of rats. Until now, Jane had no reckoning of the extent of my research, perhaps deluding herself to believe my intentions were honest and my motive career-driven. All that would change with the rats. Any new drug beyond the current batch would require new test subjects, and no sane person stored rats in their home. Vials and Bunsen burners may be acceptable for an eccentric but still socially stable mad scientist, but rats, no. They wrecked the charade and screamed, "Psycho!" It was time to sleep. Swallowing the sleep combo drug and energizing the sleeper unit, I closed my eyes, still pondering Jane, my rats, my inventor's block, and my last nightmare drug test. I needed a change, a transformation, something. I did my final reality check, perpetuating all of Carl's training, then my head bobbed, and I fell asleep. When I next awoke, my head felt groggy. I was no longer in the living room, instead finding myself in my laboratory. It was even darker than I remembered, scarier. There were rats everywhere. Evidently, I had chosen my work over Jane because the rats were copious, nibbling at everything, scurrying about as if they owned the lab. Then Jane appeared next to me. Interesting. She held my hand as if we were a happy, rat-raising family. She swapped her gray scrubs for rat-themed ones. Beautiful. Yes, the cat's out of the bag, or rather, the rat's out of the bag. Everything seemed natural, yet wildly incongruous. I started to reassure myself. Of course Jane should be with me, and we should be working in the lab with the test vermin. Of course there should be thousands of multiplying rats swarming at our feet, disturbing test tubes and equipment. But Jane did not look quite like Jane, and I would never have ordered so many rats. And why was I watching myself in third person, like a ghost departing his own soul? And why those hideous rat scrubs? The facts of the image concealed the truth until a light switch clicked. Mental clarity. I was in a dream. That's why I didn't awake wearing the sleep apparatus. That's why Jane wasn't quite Jane. That's why I could float observing pawns in a room of rats. That's why nothing made clear sense and yet seemed so convincing. But I couldn't know I was in a dream unless I was lucidly dreaming. That meant it worked. That meant my lucid drug had done it, and I was consciously awake in the sleep state. I started to shout, "I did it! I did it!" Each time I repeated the phrase with more confidence and less surprise. The realization startled my sleep and I awoke, this time in reality. No rats, only the nightmare of burdensome sleep equipment and circulation tubes attached to my arms. I checked the clock. I had 5 more hours to capture for Ray and had likely contaminated this sample. Clients hated spliced sleep. They expected the potency of sleep drugs to guarantee no interruptions. I prepared to restart the clock when I remembered that if I were to test a new drug, I would need more rats. Then I remembered my dream and my lucidity. I had just experienced the first stages of lucidity and had almost forgotten everything upon waking. Like any sleep, the memory of my dream had quickly vanished until sparked by a related thought. I was living proof of the lucidity steps, born of my drugs. Carl had warned me. True lucidity takes time. But here was its start. I had cracked the code. In time, many would dream as I, or Carl.
John, it's not enough to be a lucid dreamer, instructed Carl long ago. You have to learn to wake up. I don't mean wake up from the dream, which is going to happen when you get excited or distracted. I mean wake up within the dream. Great guild members have a skill for waking up. It is usually very simple. They recognize the semi-truth. Dreams appear real and convincing because we have deactivated our logic sensors. You must learn to watch for the absurdities, recognize patterns that do not make sense, question illogical connections. If you can realize you are in a dream, you will be able to control that dream.
Since the time Carl had passed on this wisdom, I had practiced common lucidity techniques to question dream content, including rehearsing while awake, always hoping I would someday succeed in slumber. I had counted my fingers millions of times, it seemed, and my pathetic dream journal never missed capturing an entry, no matter how weak the dream. But none of those tricks had mattered till now. The rats, the lab, Jane, my strange third-person self, it all seemed so illogical that it had to be a dream. I knew it. In the dream, I reached the conclusion, and that ended the moment, the excitement stirring my waking mind. I stepped away from the machine and pulled the plugs, unable to restart Ray's sleep upload. This was too exciting. I had done it. My training had worked. My drug, which would need months, maybe years of validation, had worked. I walked to the balcony to silently shout to the world. There were no puffy clouds, no setting sunrise congratulating my success. Those were only in my dreams. Instead, darkness greeted my victory, the birth of Project Cumulus. The night had come, and storm clouds beat upon the city. Even the all-too-present city lights were muffled by the storm. I was alone, but triumphant. 3 days elapsed since the historic first moment of lucidity. Swimming with new ideas and questions, I had canceled each subsequent night with Jane. The discovery consumed all sleeping and waking hours, leaving little time for introspection, work, or love life. Only repetition and refinement mattered. My Cumulus drug didn't activate lucidity like an on-off switch, nor had I intended such a drastic transformation. Cumulus would allow the user, given measurable effort, to awaken dreamland. Manipulation was then up to the sleeper. In fact, the drug functioned as Carl postulated, via awareness. We hypothesized a drug that would artificially succeed where Carl's instruction and training had failed. Since high school, I had wandered lost in a mental maze, painfully trying to apply Carl's training until by accident it worked. I had tried every night for 15 years to unlock a door in the unconscious state. I knew that the key was in testing the logic of the sleep realm. I knew that if I could match the key to the door, I would open a world of possibilities. But I did not possess the key. Cumulus gave me the right key, and the room suddenly opened, and it was extraordinary.